Look at this crowd. Thousands of people marching in the open, asking a democratic government for jobs and equal rights. Now look at this group. Militant, heavily armed and organized to police the police themselves. When confronted with two movements that look this different, our first instinct is usually to ask how they organized their members, secured their funding, and planned their operations. We rarely stop to ask the harder question: why do they hold these specific, contrasting beliefs in the first place? There is an entire academic field originally designed to answer that exact question. Political sociology was built to examine how underlying social structures, things like a person's class, community, or economic status, shape their political behavior. For decades, researchers in this discipline dug into the backgrounds of everyday people to figure out what drives one group towards peaceful reform while pushing another towards violent revolution. But in the late 20th century, the discipline broke away from its foundations. Researchers turned their back on the study of political aims, focusing instead on the organizational machinery required to sustain a protest. Today, the field is dominated by the study of mobilization. Researchers track how groups gather resources, recruit followers, and navigate the political environments around them. This logistical framework is applied to every group in the same way, whether they are asking for universal health care or if they are trying to overthrow a government. The actual contents of the movement, the core grievances that get people out of bed and onto the streets, are largely treated as background noise. They are considered raw material, but stay outside the scope of the theory. By focusing purely on the logistics of growth, the field has left the underlying motivations of these groups largely unexplored. We mapped the blueprints for how movements scale, but lost the ability to explain why they want to scale in the first place. In the mid-20th century, the primary goal of political sociology was connecting social class and rapid societal change directly to radical politics. One major approach was rooted in Marxist theory. Researchers sought to explain radical movements through the lens of class conflict, arguing that a person's place within the economic system dictated their political path. An alternative approach traced its origins to Emil Durkheim. This school argued that the psychological strain caused by rapid societal change is what drives disoriented individuals into extremist groups. These models were elegant, but they shared a common problem. They consistently failed to predict the outbreak of actual protests in the real world. When researchers dug into the 1848 insurrections in Paris, reality defied structural theory. The actors fighting on both sides of the barricades often came from identical working-class backgrounds. Because these grand theories heavily overpredicted radicalism and failed rigorous empirical tests, sociologists looked for a completely different framework. In the 1970s, the field executed a hard turn toward what became known as resource mobilization and political process theories. This shift responded to the free rider problem. Logically, individuals won't pay the costs of protesting if they can absorb the movement's benefits for free. To solve this, sociologists focused on the organizations, networks, and incentives required to get people to show up. This new lens provided highly reliable results. For the first time, researchers could accurately forecast things like strike durations and union growth by measuring organizational strength and political opportunity. Sociologists successfully mapped the machinery of protest, but in the process, they stopped asking why the machine was built in the first place. The modern assumption is that a movement's political orientation is merely a byproduct of surviving within a specific political environment. Many researchers argue that radicalism is just a tactical response. If a state relies on severe police repression and shuts down open democratic channels, movements adapt by becoming secretive and militant to stay alive. But tactical adaptation cannot explain the deep psychological molding required to generate this level of fervent commitment. A hostile environment might force a group to go underground, but it doesn't explain the internal identity and worldview that makes people willing to die for a cause. Strategic advantage offers an incomplete answer. It fails to explain how everyday people are structurally conditioned to adopt radical worldviews before the first protest ever begins. The path forward for political sociology requires connecting the study of mobilization back to the social origins of belief. The specific way a movement frames its appeals is grounded in a group's lived reality. Whether that is the hierarchy of a factory floor, the social networks of a neighborhood parish, or the economic conflict between a small farmer and a middleman, social movements are not strategic machines operating in a vacuum. To understand contentious politics, we have to look past the mechanics of how a group fights and return to investigating how their specific social conditions dictate what they are fighting for.